Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we're coming to you from the busy hallways of the Conservative Leadership Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, a red meat gathering of the faithful engaged in political introspection, education, and planning. We've got two guests for you who are among the many speakers at the conference, gently pushing the organization toward a more thoughtful and inclusive version of conservatism. The first, Father Robert Sirico, is the founder and president of the Acton Institute, whose self-described mission is to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. In the second half of the show, we have Michael Cannon, Director of Health Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, who'll deconstruct the Halbig versus Sebelius case, which probably represents the most significant challenge to the ever-changing Affordable Care Act. But first, let's get the headphones on Father Sirico and see what makes him tick. Father, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Father, it's not every day that one meets a Catholic priest dedicated to the moral defense of free market capitalism, much less one who started out a committed leftist palling around with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the journey that brought you here.
Well, you know, I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and in my early youth acquired a real social sense of responsibility. My neighbor was a Holocaust survivor, and I saw the beginnings of the civil rights movement, so I understood that there were certain injustices in the world. It touched your heart. It did. It really did. And then the 60s came and the 70s, and it just blew away my faith, really. And eventually I was involved in the left because of social justice concerns and because of personal confusions as well. And so I was active in a variety of social change movements, and then met a friend of mine who was like walking into a buzzsaw, because he just said, well, have you read this? Have you read that? Have you read the other thing? He said, you know, you're delightfully dumb. Read. And I did. I took him up on the challenge, because whatever my confusions, I was always intellectually honest. You know, I wanted the truth of things, and I wanted to find the best way. And you were on some sort of exploratory journey. I was. Yeah, I really was. Since a child, I had a sense of mission, but it was difficult to understand what that sense. And what were these books that led you back to both your convictions and to the church? I think the first one, he started nicely with me, The Law by Friedrich Bastiat, which is a wonderful book. It's not so much a book that tells you what to think, but how to think. And you can read it in an afternoon. It's really a great book. The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. Of course. Socialism and Human Action, which were much more difficult. It took me really years to get into that. Mises is hard to plow through. Yeah, well, he did give me the companion book, Mises Made Easier. Okay. So I could, but that still wasn't easy. Version. Well, it's a kind of glossary. And I read Rand. I read Milton Friedman. So I kind of got a real inundation. Now, remember, I'm away from my faith at this point. Right. In my life. But as I began to think about these things, I began to look more deeply into human nature. What is it that gives man the right to his life, to private property, and all of these things? Oddly enough, Rand was helpful, because that was the first re-articulation of the natural law theory that I had learned in catechism. But through the eyes of a hardcore atheist. Hardcore atheist. But when it came to human rights, she spoke to you. Yeah, she did. And then I went back to Aquinas and went back to my heritage. And is that what led you to the seminary? It eventually did. This is really telescoping this. Sure. But yeah, it did. And when I got to seminary, I was appalled, because this was the age of liberation theology. John Paul II had just been elected. You said that it was surprising that a priest would be defending freedom, but there was a man who understood human liberty and defended it, and was... That's true. Who lived under communism, really, who understood and what the opposite of freedom was all about. Helped to bring it down. So he was a spiritual light for you. Yes, yeah, he was on both a spiritual level but also an intellectual level. He helped me to make some distinctions. And yet the liberation theology movement was raging. The socialist branch of the Catholic Church was in ascendance. How did you deal with that in the seminary? Had lots of arguments. And they tolerated it? Yeah, I mean, they did, because I would go back and read. I mean, I always had to read twice as much as my other classmates. I also had a very good professor who would encourage me to read. He was not ideological at all. I'd pose these questions, these philosophical questions about human knowledge and how we know things, and kind of talk to him about what I knew from Hayek. And he said, well, I haven't really read Hayek, but you might be interested in Michael Polanyi. And so I read Michael Polanyi, which is Personal Knowledge, which is a wonderful correspondence to Hayek.
Interesting.
Polanyi speaks about tacit knowledge, which is kind of what Hayek is doing in The Fatal Conceit.
Yep.
And then there was Newman, who was, more than 100 years before, who was just beatified. And there's a whole notion of the illative sense in Newman, this kind of innate knowledge of things. So I was seeing connections that I haven't seen anybody else make.
But you managed to bring faith and reason together. You took your vows and you
became a priest.
And then we find you now writing a book called Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy, which I've recently reread. And you state in there that civilizations fail when virtues are eroded from within.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
My great fear is that we end up neglecting our virtues, not so much just rejecting them. I mean, de facto, they end up being rejected. But a lot of it is just this withering of an understanding and the need for virtue. It seems like if you talk with a lot of young people today, among some of them, it's just, virtue, what is that?
It's the moral compass. Irrelevant. Is that where you're...
Well, yes, it's a moral compass. But I think a lot of people today just, their full summation of the moral question is, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. I mean, that's absurd, philosophically.
Well, they've been raised to understand the world through the lens of moral relativism.
Exactly.
That tends to be how they're taught in school.
Exactly. And this cannot sustain a civilization worthy of man.
Well, we're seeing the signs. You talk about the demographic winter that's descending on Europe, and you also talk about a syndrome called humanophobia, which is shared by many environmentalists.
Right.
Are these two sides? Yeah. Are these two sides of the same coin?
I think very much so. It kind of presumes that every additional person is a net drain on the productivity of society. Right. So the presupposition here is that we're all in this lifeboat that can only hold so many people. So if somebody else comes along, we have to push them off the lifeboat, failing to see that human beings are the solution.
Well, one mouth, two hands, and more importantly, one brain.
Exactly. Or, as my departed friend, Julian Simon used to say, the ultimate resource. Which, by the way, I don't know if he actually read it, but John Paul II has a phrase in one of his encyclicals that I've often thought was...
Came out of the ultimate resource?
Well, the way he put it was, man is man's ultimate resource. That's in the encyclical.
His ability to solve problems and innovate is certainly an important part of why the planet can sustain 7 billion
And this is
people.
all part of Western anthropology, Christian anthropology, this notion of human creativity and responsibility for our world, stewardship.
You passionately defend capitalism even as you deride consumerism. What's the difference, and how do they interplay?
Well, let me first say that I do defend free markets, but it's not so much capitalism, because I think capitalism is too narrow a word. It focuses on one dimension of human liberty, only on the capital, only on the financial dimension. Capitalism isn't a full-scale philosophy. It doesn't answer questions about human purpose and meaning. It just tells you certain facts about exchange. But if you talk about a free society, then you're free, or free economy. Then you have the opportunity to bring in certain moral norms that preserve the freedom, but allow culture to grow and allow things that can't be accounted for in a market. For instance, a family is not based on a free market.
This was actually Rand's biggest shortcoming, not understanding a theory of the family.
I think that's exactly it, because she never had any children.
No. And her characters, all her family characters, were all dysfunctional.
Right. And I think the only kids in Atlas Shrugged were those who were killed. They were mean, ugly kids who were killed in that train crash. Yeah.
So you see a way to broaden out the definition of capitalism to include other elements of society, but again, as expressed through free market behaviors and principles. including the foundation of the family. And I guess that comes back to your concerns about the demographic winter that we're going through, where more and more people are choosing not to have children.
Well, when they lose hope, people don't have children. They don't build for the future. The church I'm in, I'm the pastor of a church that must be about, it's about 120 years old. And the ancestors who built that, largely Polish Americans, built that church for 150 years. And they knew they would build beyond. Michelangelo never saw St. Peter's Basilica, right?
Yeah, there was
people did that. They would spend their whole lives.
For the ages.
The thing would take 500 years to make. I think when people have a sense of the value of things as such, they're not limited. And I think that not having children...
And yet those of us who are not people of faith see our immortality in our children.
Yes. Well, you should think that. You would think that.
You would think that. So
how have they been? It's the same thing with Jewish people, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? Because, of all the people in the world who have taken it on the head for being ruthless, greedy capitalists, the Jews are, and yet, at least in the United States, they make up the largest percentage per capita of progressives. So it's interesting.
It's interesting how that all fits together. Speaking of progressives, to change the subject a little bit, you point out that every scheme of redistribution that has defied the right of property has created more poverty. Why are we humans so impervious to those lessons of history?
I think we want simple answers. I think, to a great extent, we're lazy intellectually. When you're talking about property, you have to have a bigger perspective.
You define property as a human right.
A human right, the extension of human rights, the safeguard for human freedom, because in the real world, that's how we, if I have my property and it's respected, then you can't really transgress on that. And I think a lot of our social battles would be put to an end if people really took property more seriously. I think people don't understand property. They understand it as the ownership of a physical object.
But even if they don't understand it, don't they understand history? We've seen time and time again. Now we're seeing it again in Venezuela. We saw it in Cuba. We saw it in the Soviet Union. It doesn't work.
Yeah, but there are incentives put in place in all of those places that buy constituencies for the power elite. And the marginalized see an opportunity to get a quick resolution to their problem, and so they vote in these dictators.
This is a triumph of free stuff over freedom.
Yeah.
Which we're seeing here in our own country.
Yeah. Didn't Bastiat made that point, He said the state is the great myth whereby everybody thinks that everybody can live at the expense of everybody else.
But we're educated to believe that, and I have to ask, have our educational institutions failed us? You lament that you can visit almost any American university, and of course you find people that are praising freedom, and yet they admire the most ruthless totalitarians. Why? Che Guevara shirts on college kids. He's a mass murderer.
But ask these kids who Che Guevara was. I think it's just fashion. I really do think it's just for a few of them.
Is the left better at using fashion? Are they the experts at fashion?
Yeah, I think the whole PC thing, they're better at doing that. Progressives value the new because it's new, whereas people who believe in freedom and the whole legacy of Western civilization tend to have a certain reverence for the tradition. And so it's
for things that have been tried and worked or not worked.
Yeah.
Even if they can't explain why.
Right. It's that tacit knowledge again.
Which is, in some sense, the definition of conservatism. They're conserving, whether they know why or not.
Right.
Look, it's worked so far, let's not mess with it.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's a problem to conservatism, too, because if you're just conserving for the sake of conserving, then, this isn't rational either.
Which leads to how we think about changing our situation. I've spent most of my life in the competitive markets, and I've learned a lot about competition and cooperation. Tell us about the interplay between those two and how this impacts the balance between profits and charity, which you spend a lot of time talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing you need to know about competition is that it is not the superficial thing that a lot of politically sensitive, socially sensitive people think it is. They don't want you to have grades. Some. They don't want you to break up into teams where one is going to win.
Everybody gets a prize.
Everybody gets a prize. I think that's very dangerous and demeaning. And I think people at some level understand that. What competition really is, and this is really Hayek's point, is that it is a form of social planning.
Information gathering.
It's information gathering that takes place not by licensing and not by monopoly. It takes place by people competing, and then when you have the competition and this one person does a better job than another, you know what doesn't work.
But through the choices of their customers.
Right.
People love the word choice. They love to celebrate the word choice.
Yes.
And yet when you use it in the economic realm, all of a sudden people become enemies of choice.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
I think that progressives tend to think that people don't have choices, that the poor don't really have lots of alternatives. And of course it's true that the poor don't have as many alternatives or opportunities as wealthier people. But what's the solution to that?
Right.
The solution to that is create more opportunities. That is, increase the market, increase the supply of goods and services that make people wealthy.
Well, that's certainly done a lot to bring the developing world out of poverty.
It's amazing.
We've seen a meteoric decline in extreme poverty
Right.
in the developing world because free markets are penetrating there. And sometimes that makes people uncomfortable. I mean, I'm lucky to be an American because my grandparents immigrated here to work in the garment industry. I never thought I'd hear a priest defending sweatshops as a means to help the poor, but you
I
managed
think everybody
to pull it
should
off.
have air conditioning.
There you go. Can you describe your theory of sweatshops? I found it very interesting.
Well, I mean, it's the entrance into prosperity. That, of course, at the beginning, people are in circumstances that are not what they would like to be.
A poor rural village with nothing to eat is a tough place to be.
And the sweatshop at least gives them the opportunity to begin. I'm not talking about exploitative sweatshops in the sense that people are kept there by guards and stuff like this. Or this same thing, I know this is going to drive some people up a wall, but it's the same thing with child labor. We kind of look at it from our vantage point here in the United States, and we think this is terrible, these children are working on these things. But if you look at it from the context of those nations themselves, this is a step for their betterment, and they know that.
They want to take the path that we took.
Yeah, but you know, these kids who can't work making rugs or these other things, their alternative is not school, it's prostitution. So what would you rather them doing? Working with somebody? Now, again, I'm not talking about places where people abuse people, but
places where people work by choice.
Where they work by choice, and I think we could, especially if these come into the light of day and they're not kind of
Well, publicity and transparency does a lot to that.
Yeah.
You know, Nike cares about their brand.
They really do.
Right? And they spend a lot of time going over there.
Right.
Yes, they want to find the best value and the lowest price, but they don't want to be besmirched by slave drivers in a factory situation they're not comfortable with.
Exactly.
And when has it ever been more transparent than it is today? I mean, 50 years ago, you could hide this stuff. Now it shows up on the internet 5 minutes later.
Yeah, exactly.
On that same point, you're not a big fan of laws that make it hard or even impossible for businesses to lay people off, and you would think that that's sacrilege. Why is that?
Because I don't believe that decisions to lay people off are generally arbitrary decisions.
They're painful, having done it a number
yes,
of times.
me too. You know, and this is, by the way, a great plague in the church. We have secretaries who have been inept for 30 years and nobody fires them. And so they think, oh, that's very nice of the pastor. He's keeping this lady on. Is it really a nice thing when your people are giving you money on Sunday from their retirement funds and you're keeping somebody on who you have to compensate in some way? You have to find somebody else to do the job. I think it also is disrespectful to the person because you're not being honest.
It denies them a chance to find someone where they're place where they're a better fit.
Right. So I'm not thrilled about just go in there and fire people, but the market will tell you what you need to do, and it's an information system, and it makes no sense to disregard the information that's being put at your disposal.
Well, as you point out in your book, labor flexibility allows for markets to grow, technologies to change. Otherwise, we'd still be riding horses.
Yeah.
When you talk about people with fewer choices, and certainly the poor do have fewer choices, You talk about the idol of equality as a false god, if you will, and also you talk about the value that the demonized 1% offer to society. How do those two relate?
Well, first of all, morally speaking, surely it is not the gap between people that is the moral concern, right? Who cares that Bill Gates has so much more than Warren Buffett? Who cares? Is that a moral question? The real question is the floor, not the gap and not the ceiling, but the floor. And as far as I know, the best guarantee for a solid floor where people rise to the level of their abilities is a freer market, less regulations, less taxes, less barriers to trade.
Easier step to the first rung of the economic ladder.
Exactly, and then you're on your way up. So I would begin right there.
You have nothing good to say about central planning in your book.
I'm talking about economic central planning, of course.
Societal, economic, top-down, not
social,
not inside a corporation.
Right,
planning inside a corporation where you own all the assets,
right?
And you live or die on your own decisions is a different. It's a different.
And a smart executive is going to really consult widely.
But I want to come back to the largest central planning exercise going on right now here of some controversy, and that's Obamacare. Now, this was initially supported by the American Bishops' Conference, who actually didn't turn on it until they realized they weren't going to get a religious exception for their forced provision of abortifacients and birth control. Were they wrong to get behind Obamacare at the outset?
Yes, I think they were, but this isn't a new thing. The Bishops' Conference was on this bandwagon for, I would say probably 40 years. I mean, they were one of the first groups to call for this.
To call healthcare a right.
Yes. I mean, not quite. That's not the doctrine of the church. Mm-hmm. But they wouldn't say, this is the model. Mm-hmm. Doctrinally, they were smart enough to say, what we're in favor of doctrinally is a right to universal access to health care. Now, I don't have any problem with that. Mm-hmm. They don't specify the particular.
And how it's provided.
Right. When the proposals were put up, they were in favor of it. And I said at the time, you will rue the day.
It will bite you.
It will bite you the way it's bit Catholic social services, Catholic charities, Catholic adoption agencies, where you can't control the culture of your
he who pays the
business.
piper calls the tune.
Right.
Is this not always true?
It is.
So how was your criticism dealt with inside the church?
Well, at various times in various ways. When I first began making these criticisms, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal in the early 1990s called Charities on the Dole, and it was not received very well by the Catholic Bishops' Conference because it basically said that the Catholic Charities receives 2/3 of its funding from the federal government. And at what point do you accept their agenda rather than having your own agenda? And I testified before Congress and received a great deal of pressure. But I made certain distinctions. Charlie Rangel asked me in my testimony if I was representing the Bishops' Conference, and I said no. I said I didn't claim to represent the Bishops' Conference. I'm an American citizen, and I've read about these things, and I have concern. Oh, so you're not, well, what is this Acton Institute? I said, well, it's an institute that studies these kinds of things. And he said, do you get tax exemption? I said, yes. He said, well, that's a form of subsidy. And I said, and by the way, this argument is quite resilient because I think it's going to come up
the
again.
argument that if I don't steal from you, I subsidize you is
right.
is
well,
never going to leave us.
This is what I said to Rangel in the 60s. I said, I see where you're going. I said, I don't happen to believe that the money that's produced is the government's money in the first place. I think it happens to be the property of the people who produced it.
How did he react to that?
He said, no, Father. This is the way we do it up here.
I could just imagine you two New Yorkers talking to each other about this.
It's on the internet.
I'll have to go look it up. Well, look, in the time we have left, since you brought up the Acton Institute, tell us what the Acton Institute is, more about your work there, and how people can learn about it.
Well, it was founded in 1990 as an alternative voice on the part of morally sensitive people. We're an ecumenical institute. It's not a Catholic institute, although I'm a Catholic priest. But the majority of our staff are not Catholic. The majority of our supporters are not Catholic.
Now, does it have the blessing of the Catholic Church? Or
no, it's an independent organization.
Okay. So it doesn't need the blessing, but...
No. No, it doesn't need the blessing. And, when I retire, there's no necessity the Catholic priest would head the institute. So we started it because what we wanted to do was address the religious community, because we believe that people have really great intentions, but they don't understand how to achieve them in a way that can, really ensure the well-being of the poor. It's not enough to say, we want these programs for the poor, if these programs ensure you have more poor people.
Well, this is the great conundrum of the progressives, because their intentions are good for the most part.
Yeah.
And yet, look at the results.
Absolutely. Yeah, over and over again. So to this end, we hold seminars. We have a big June university. We call it a university. It's a 4-day large seminar. About 1,000 people come, 120 or so classes, 60 professors on all kinds of topics. We have been producing a number of DVDs and documentaries over the last number of years that are really high quality. So we're getting a lot of traction in the religious community and outside the religious community.
Very good. And how can people learn about it?
Acton.org, ACTON.org. And also take a look at our povertycure.org, which is a whole extensive effort to answer the question, which is better for the developing world, aid or trade? And this comes from the mouths of the developing world.
Father, thanks so much for being on the program. It's been a delight chatting with you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Father Robert Sirico, coming to you from the Conservative Leadership Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Next up, Michael Cannon from Cato to delve into the bowels of Obamacare. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Stay tuned.